I'm going to talk a little bit about some things that might sound a bit irreverent to you coming from somebody like myself. But I've spent over 40 years now working as an entrepreneur and intrapreneur, and I suppose at one point I would have been called a social entrepreneur. And in fact, oftentimes among those who have been credited with pioneering the topic or the global spread of this notion of social entrepreneurship when I was the founding manager director of the Schwab Foundation for Social Entrepreneurs. I have to tell you that over the last decade, I have increasingly disliked the term social entrepreneurship. And in fact, we have dropped that term from the Scholl Center. Why, you might ask? Well, because at one point in time, it served to actually designate how these particular kinds of entrepreneurs were different in terms of what drove them than just straight commercial entrepreneurs. But what it's done today, and I see this increasingly with many of the students and people that are really entrepreneurial and want to bring both spheres together, is that as long as we use the term social entrepreneurship, and what's anti-social entrepreneurship? So we continue to dichotomize. This is where I do good, and this is where I make my money. And that is exactly what's wrong with the world today, is that we have continued to separate these spheres, and it's really brought us into the kinds of problems that we are experiencing. So one of the really welcome trends that I see happening is this beginning to blend these spheres. And I like to say that every entrepreneur should be mindful of social and environmental impact, whether your focus is completely commercial, which it can't be, or you'll be delegitimized from society, or otherwise. And social entrepreneurs who only think that doing good is the right thing are also going to not be sustainable whatsoever. You need to be financially viable. So 15 years ago, let's say, many of us leading this global movement to to highlight the role of social entrepreneurs. For us, that designation was important. Why? As I said, because it served to, highlight, here's Muhammad Yunus, look what he's done with an investment model, Grameen Bank, and that's how he's different from X, Y, or Z straight commercial. But as I said, that term really has come to perhaps drive more walls between us. So the other thing that it did was it seduced us into creating that somehow these entrepreneurs were going to solve the world's problems, which also led to the myth of the creation of what I call the Herepreneur, and all of the other myths that sprung up around the Herepreneur, which of course is part of also the Silicon Valley myth, all of these, techie entrepreneurs that came into being and made millions. So that kind of galvanized a whole idea around the myth of the Herepreneur. Now, I'm not denying that these individuals are exceptional people. And if you hang around with them enough, you realize that they are very unusual. Many of them have been misfits in society. They are, perhaps, doctors or lawyers or whatever that have seen a different path, a different approach, and have been rejected by their peers, even by their families. I can tell you story upon story of how, entrepreneurs who saw a different way of being or a different pattern of approaching a problem in their discipline were rejected by those people who were their peers as well as their own families and told, you know what, it can't be done, you're crazy. How many people were told they were crazy and actually have changed the world? So I think that, there's no denying that these people are unusual, they're stubborn, they're resilient, they're persistent. The word that they most hear is no, it can't be done, and that kind of galvanizes them into action. And many of them, in order to drive that transformational social change, have actually set up for-profits or not-for-profits to actually drive their mission. If they were for-profit setup, it was not to maximize profit, but that fit their mission the best. If it was a not-for-profit, it was not to go around begging for money. It was actually because that achieved the mission of social change that they were engaged in. And now I've become a spokesperson for really looking at a much more, I'd say, pragmatic and realistic approach of the role of the entrepreneur and a deeper understanding that it takes teams and a supportive ecosystem to actually help that entrepreneur, the visionary entrepreneur, happen. And those teams comprise individuals who are deeply committed to the vision of the entrepreneur and who have a vast array of talents that are critically important to helping that entrepreneur's vision actually come to fruition, and without which it wouldn't happen. So I think that you will talk to any entrepreneur, any successful entrepreneur, and ask them what actually helped them, and they will see, if I hadn't had the people that worked for me, that helped me along these lines, I would have never been able to accomplish what I did. And what these herepreneurs have done that we've canonized is actually to galvanize the right team behind them. And we can talk about that and what that takes if you want in the Q&A. These people have simply been the unreasonable people who refuse to accept, oh, it can't be done. But they've inspired others to think that, yes, it can be done. And if you've ever seen that little teeny clip on YouTube by Derek Sivers, which says, leadership is overrated, it's actually the first follower that matters the most. And they have created a whole movement of first followers. So again, those teams are critically important. And one of the things, if we look back over the last 200 years, is we've seen the development of an entire ecosystem to support the growth of commercial ventures, whether these are accounting firms, legal firms, consulting firms, government policies and practices that encourage entrepreneurial ventures in the commercial sector. What we're seeing now happen is exactly the same thing in the sector, where you're having people go, you know what, I'm really excited about supporting these ventures, and they're coming out of the woodwork. And I know that because the MBAs that I'm now very involved with at Columbia Business School and at Oxford are really interested in getting involved in those spaces where they recognize I am not an entrepreneur, because recognize that few of us are really crazy. Most of us will never be entrepreneurs, but every one of us wants to work with companies that or organizations that are fundamentally innovative, philosophically positive, and morally compelling, and who really want to combine where I make my money and where I do the right thing. So you're seeing these new, whether it's in social finance, impact investing, consulting firms that are supporting the growth of social ventures. You're seeing a whole cadre, a whole ecosystem spring up around these ventures, and it really is a systems approaching thing. Companies are recognizing that there's a huge generational and change, and also changes in consumer trends. And we're witnessing the rise of intrapreneurial teams within these companies that are trying to drive a different kind of change within the core business of the company, whether it means being conscious of their supply chains and who's making what under what conditions, et cetera, or, how do we become more accountable socially and environmentally for the footprint. Now you might say, oh, but that's greenwashing. They're not really. Who cares? As long as they're progressing in that trend, I'm seeing more and more of this. There's no big sea change yet, but it's definitely there. So they are really looking at how do we engage in more sustainable business practices. And when you think about it, that has some really important implications for the kind of impact that we're going to be able to see if this comes to fruition. They're trying to rethink how do we as ventures, as business ventures, rethink our role in the 21st century so that we combine business and social goals more together. I think that this realization of how the world is changing has come to make me rethink the term entrepreneur, and how for too long, I think it's been very constraining. We have focused on the entrepreneurs on the creation of ventures, right? When in fact, I love the idea of being entrepreneuring, which is an action verb. You can be entrepreneuring wherever you are, whether you're in an 800-year-old university like I am today, and I was telling the joke before about when I first came to Oxford, I was said, do you know the Oxford joke? And it was, well, how many Oxford dons does it take to change a light bulb? And the response was, change? So, you know, you're in an institution that is so ingrained in these things, but actually Oxford's been a fantastic place to actually drive through these kinds of innovative initiatives because it's entirely chaotic and nobody's my own boss, so I can do whatever the hell I want, which is really a great way, you know, to operate. So at any rate, you can be entrepreneuring wherever you are. Government, a little bit harder, but you can still be entrepreneuring, and within companies, you're seeing, you know, the growth of these corporate social venturing, corporate venturing, and you're seeing the formation of these entrepreneuring teams. So there are very exciting developments to address market and government failures from these kinds of entrepreneurial ventures. But I also want to describe 3 critical challenges that I see, or I would like to say traps, in this, let's call it, impact entrepreneuring world. And the first trap, and I might be, you know, stepping on some toes here, but I really see it as the fault, in a funny way, of academia, combined with some of the issues that we see around this response to using entrepreneurial approaches to social change. And that's this massive epidemic of accelerators, incubators, hackathons, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We're all focusing on that startup issue, you know. Let's get these guys going, and let's get them started, and da-da-da-da-da. That's all fine and good. But where we're really missing the boat is actually in supporting those ventures that are poised for scale to get beyond the valley of death. And that takes an entirely different way of looking at that venture. And we're not very good at that. And so what ends up happening is that we're great to support that sexy startup phase, but then as they start to get into those really tricky problems, it's not such a hot topic anymore. So that, for me, is where we should be focusing on, is really getting those really promising ventures that have proven the prototype, that have really proven that they have something to go on to get them further along. The other one really grows out of this trap number 1, and that's trap number 2. And again, I put the blame on, you know, much of what we've done from the business school approaches, et cetera, which is this idea that, you know what, just come up with a business plan. And you are actually coming up with a solution to a problem you don't even understand. So it's a solution in search of a problem. I see this across the board, students coming and going, you know what, I'm actually passionate about Africa. I've never been to Africa, but I'm passionate about Africa. And I'm passionate about, you know, helping small farmers be more productive. They don't know twit about farming. And so they have never, what we call, apprenticed with the problem. If you have not lived the problem, if you have not felt the problem, if you are not there with the problem and really understand why did the problem emerge, who are the entrenched stakeholders in keeping that status quo going, what is, you know, who are the actors that are trying to solve this problem, who has failed, who is achieving, et cetera. If you have not really done your homework in terms of this, and this is what is the big trend now, is, oh, just solve the problem, you will never be successful. So this apprenticing with the problem is the most important element in being a successful social change agent from wherever you are. And it's the only way to come up with a successful venture. Now, the third is really a perception that emanates from my having lived in the UK now for about 7 years. And it's this very active role that the government has taken in promoting what they call social enterprise. Ugh, another term that I hate. I see the same model being replicated in Australia. And for me, it's not catalytic entrepreneurship. Catalytic entrepreneurship is about disruption. When have you ever heard a government finance a disruptive social change initiative? It's an oxymoron. Government is about status quo. Let's preserve the status quo. Let's support these ventures that are charities, that are now calling themselves social enterprises because maybe they have a stream of earned revenue, but they're basically subcontractors to government for services that the government no longer wants to or can provide. So these are very well-meaning people, wonderful human beings. We desperately need those kinds of charities to operate in terms of addressing issues or palliating or assuaging, suffering from home violence, from all of those ills that we seem to be, pervading our society. But they are not addressing the root causes of the problem. And that is what we need. We need catalytic entrepreneurial ventures that are going to address the real core roots of the problem. And that takes a very different kind of entrepreneur. So I think that, while this push to have government step in to support startups that are addressing issues that the government defines as important or that one could define, but that they don't want to actually challenge government, we need to be very mindful of that, of that tendency. But government is essential, don't get me wrong, in terms of promoting the right conditions, the ecosystem, the policies that are going to allow these kinds of changes to happen. And certainly from having come to Australia over the last 42 years, one of the tendencies I see is for an over-dependence on government. Everything is dominated by government in this country. And it's actually, we need to begin to consider what that means in terms of really catalytic social change. Again, at the startup phase, I'm less excited about government involvement. Government is, as I said, really important in promoting that ecosystem that's going to support those already successful ventures go to scale. And I've seen this time and time again. Once the disruption has been evident and successful. And that gets us into the whole monitoring and evaluation that I'm not going to have time to get into. But if you are not keeping track of how your process and your engagement of actually taking forward that change is happening and where your successes are and where it is, and really getting stakeholder feedback from your users, it's going to be very difficult for you to actually get the funding and ramp up where you need to ramp up. I want to really conclude with some of the more, the more exciting developments for me from working with the business sector, the entrepreneurial sector, et cetera. I think that what we're seeing happening in the corporate world, very, very nascent, is quite exciting, where you're actually looking at companies that are going, hang on a minute, we need to really re-examine our role as business, as a business actor, having a social function. We must really keep in touch with where our consumers are going and what the trends are there. And many of them are looking at how do we partner with entrepreneurs who are actually engaged with on-the-ground efforts to deal with some of these issues that we face on a day-to-day basis. Very, very incipient, but I'll give you a very specific example. One of the biggest villains in the world that we all love to demonize is McDonald's. And it was interesting to see how the Marine Stewardship Council out of London had been for years trying to get McDonald's Europe to actually begin to change some of its practices around sustainable fisheries. As you know, the fishing industry is very much threatened by the lack of sustainability in terms of fishing, and fish stocks are dwindling worldwide. But what they finally, and this is key too, finding that intrapreneur within the company who relates to what you're trying to do and actually says, you know what, let's see about this link. Let's explore. So it took Rupert House, who's the CEO of the Marine Stewardship Council 5 years to find a voice within McDonald's that was going to actually listen and was at a senior enough level to be able to affect change. And as a result, they were able to actually get McDonald's Europe to begin to certify that to begin to certify Marine Stewardship Council fisheries, so that every single fish product that you bought in a McDonald's was coming from sustainable fisheries. But McDonald's went one step further, which was to say, we're not going to give up on our suppliers. We're not going to say we're not going to use you anymore. We're only going to use the fisheries that are certified by MSC. They actually supported their fisheries to become certifiable so that they opened up a wider supply chain. The interesting thing was that within McDonald's Europe, there was this whole excitement by the people who worked there, like, wow, we're really doing something good for a change. And the interesting thing there was how it infected McDonald's in the US to begin to look at this, and how they started to say, well, what can we do about, the way we package our products? What can we do about beef? What can we do about... So it began this kind of snowball effect. So this is what we're seeing happen more and more with these engagements. And next month, we're basically having a meeting at Oxford called Beyond Dialogue, where some of the biggest companies are coming to listen to entrepreneurial ventures that are working on the ground in markets where they are interested in terms of how do we improve our business practices. So this is a movement that's, beginning. Also, the B Corporation. How many of you have heard of the B Corporation? Exciting here in Australia, where you're beginning to say, it's not about divorcing where we make our money and where we do good. And it really is galvanized by a massive movement of, I think, not just, young people who are certainly a lot younger than I am, who are beginning to say, you know what, I don't want to wait till I'm 50 to give back. And as I said, just a little bit ago, this notion of giving back drives me crazy, because it's as if making money is a bad thing when making money is a great thing. It's what you do with that that really matters. And so, this idea of dichotomizing my personal from my professional life. This is where I make my money. This is where I do the right thing. When I get to be 50 and I've made a lot of money, I'm going to become a philanthropist and give it all back. No, that's no way to live. You'll live a miserable life. So, I think that people are beginning to recognize that. I think the world is changing extremely fast, so fast that we don't even see it happening sometimes. And here in Australia in particular, this idea of let's, address some of the world's global challenges. Yes, but let's address some of the challenges that we've apprenticed with in this country. There are many issues that affect Australia and affect Australians in a really tangible way, and that need to be solved with an entrepreneurial approach. And so I would urge you to look at home, to look at, what are the different approaches that I can bring here? How is my experience actually a guide? And in the previous LinkedIn festival, somebody said or asked me, how do you galvanize people who are just sort of indifferent to what goes on? And my response is nobody can be indifferent to personal issues that they are suffering, whether it is an issue with mental health, whether it is an issue with aging parents, whether it is an issue. How do you completely revolutionize our approaches to those things? So I find this a really exciting time to be entrepreneuring wherever you are, and to really infect other people with that notion that, I can actually be a change agent, and from wherever I don't need to go out and be, an entrepreneur in a hoodie coming up with a new program, a new app to, help people date, or a new app to tell me, what to wear on Monday morning. I can actually use technology in a very interesting way to drive social change. Love to get your questions and thoughts.
Thank you very much, Pamela. That was very, very challenging as well as inspiring. So ladies and gentlemen, my name is Dr. Ben Neville and I'm the Program Director of Compass, and I'm very pleased that just a week ago we changed our tagline to the Impact Entrepreneurship Program and not Social Entrepreneurship Program. So it was very, very timely. So we now have almost 30 minutes for Q&A, and Pamela is very keen to get into conversation with everybody here. Do we have any questions from the audience? Yes, please.
And please identify yourself.
Okay, thank you. Doctor, my name's Ray Cohen.
My name is Pamela, not doctor.
Thanks, Pamela. The fascination for me in your conversation was finding the distinction between those teams that work specifically in the traditional way to those teams that support catalytic change. So could you speak a little bit about that? Because I'm really interested in that. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that what you see happening in many established companies, whether they're consulting firms, whether they're legal firms, whatever, is all of a sudden you have an interesting, I'd say, perfect storm, which is young people beginning to question, do I want to go into this company? I'm not attracted to it. I'll give you a very specific example. I asked one of my big MBA classes, if an investment bank, say Barclays or whatever, came and offered you a job, how would you feel about taking that job as opposed to a Triodos bank, which has been doing impact investing for the last 30 years? They all, without a doubt, said, I'd much rather go to Triodos, even if I get less of a salary. And the interesting thing is that companies are beginning to recognize that they're getting interviewed by potential, recruits about what is the relevance of what you're doing for society. And then companies are going, wait a minute, how are we going to recruit and retain this incredible pool of talent? So what you're having happen, for example, whether it's Accenture or Bain, or whether it's Linkletter's law firm, or whether it's investment banking, et cetera, are they beginning to shape, how do we begin to retain and attract our talents? So that change is coming in that way, in a real way. And I think another thing that we've done, which we've recognized, certainly I've recognized at the business school, is our students, primarily at Said Business School, come because of the mission that we have, which is actually to use business tools to address societal challenges. And the interesting thing about the way we're doing this is that I think that many of the students, when they come to careers offices in business schools, have not caught up with this trend. And so when students go, well, what are my options in terms of employment? They'll go, well, there's investment banking, there's consulting, but, and the kids are like, forget it. And so we have started this whole thing called Launch, Careers with Social Impact. And it is a, way of bringing together practitioners in all sorts of different industries to come and expose what it is that they're doing. As I said, you don't need to be an entrepreneur in a hoodie to drive social change. So many of these students, as I said, will never become entrepreneurs, but they desperately want to work in these kinds of things. So we're seeing a slow change, but as with all traditional educational institutions, and the University of Melbourne certainly is one of those that is the longest lived one in Australia, we need to change.
Good. Any others? Right in front here. Yep.
Hi, I'm Madeleine. I'm part of the Wade Institute this year. I wondered, with the shift that you talked about in traditional business to sort of a dual purpose and profit model, to what extent do you think there's a tokenism inherent in that, in their move towards social venturing?
You know what? I don't care. I mean, sure, it starts out as tokenism. Oh my God, we're threatened. Oh my God, how are we going to recruit? How are we going to meet the bottom line? How are we going to? But pretty soon it's infectious, because what ends up happening is that more and more the research is showing that, in fact, sustainable companies that have a focus on sustainability are actually doing better commercially in terms of their shareholders. So They're becoming convinced. Not everybody's drunk the Kool-Aid, but some of the major companies, Natura, which is a multi-billion-dollar company, has just become a B corporation. Unilever is on track to be a B corporation. Danone is on track to be a B corporation. So we're beginning to see this drive on the part of large multinationals to do this. So if it starts out as tokenism, so what? It won't end up there.
We have another question at the front here.
Over here. Hi Pam, I'm James. I'm into slow money and long haul startups, but that's another story. I guess the question, I wanted to pick up on your reference to Derek Siever's TED Talk,
yeah.
right, which is around the fast follower. But it strikes me that the leadership in around some of this stuff is, around sort of particularly where in the sort of that social space is around how you can actually bring networks and build networks.
That's right.
And the leadership there strikes me as very counterintuitive to the sort of leadership that you would see in a corporate or an enterprise. Can you talk a little bit around that space?
You mean the leadership that is needed?
Yes, that network-style leadership.
Exactly. I know. And in fact, I think that that's the lesson I've learned the most from this Herepreneur myth thing, which is that many of the entrepreneurs that we sort of lifted up to this, Hollywood status became convinced of their own grandiosity and have not been able to actually overcome that massive ego. I think that what we recognize is that the people who found organizations are not necessarily the people who should be scaling those organizations, and that the biggest constraint to scaling is recruiting the right people at the right time. It's not about capital, it's really about the talent that's going to take it there. And to do that, you have to be very seductive. And you cannot be seductive if you think you're the best thing in town. So I think that, leadership is about humility. It's about being able to be, that kind of a networking person where people come to you. And that's why it's hard to be an intrapreneur. It takes a different kind of leadership style to be an intrapreneur within companies than it is to be an entrepreneur. To be an intrapreneur, you actually have to form alliances. You have to form alliances with people who are above you and people who are responding to you, as well as your peers. And that is tough unless you have a certain level of emotional intelligence, which is often lacking, and common sense, which in Spanish, I'm originally from Ecuador. In Spanish, there's a saying that common sense is the least common of the senses. And this is something that, strikes me all the time as this sort of, I know everything.
Anyone else? Yes, please.
I don't think I've got this question.
Can you just wait for the microphone, please?
I'm not sure if I've got this question formulated terribly well, but you were saying that government is kind of good for setting a good environment for businesses. I'm kind of thinking about, entrepreneurship in terms of changing government itself. And, what we're seeing in the US at the moment with Bernie Sanders, suddenly we have a whole generation of people who are happy to identify as socialists. If we have socialism, then the distinction between business and government becomes very different. If it goes all the way, it means business and government are the same thing. Another point I had, like the question of what government is, everyone sees government as someone else, whereas in a democracy, in theory, government is us. So I kind of just wonder what your thoughts are around these issues of entrepreneurship versus government, or as opposed to government, or different to government.
Okay, since you haven't formulated your question so well, let me see if I can not formulate my answer as well as you would like.
Thank you.
I don't see them as opposed. I see them as, obviously, if I look at what's happening in the US today, there is no democracy. And in fact, there's no democracy in many of our countries, including this one. I'm going to say something that probably sounds really outrageous to you, but for the last 42 years, I've seen Australia become more of a police state than I would have ever wanted. It's over-legislated. There are more politicians than kangaroos in this country. And I get really worried about that piece. So, and then citizens, all of a sudden, certainly in the US, don't feel that they have a responsibility to vote. But here you have the donkey vote because everybody's made to vote, and then you don't, you have this bizarre situation as well.
So what can entrepreneurs do in the field of government of changing the way the populace interacts with each other via government? Let's think about an entrepreneurial public sector, somebody from the public sector who's been entrepreneurial. You might want to say Donald Trump. Entrepreneurship is not always great. There have been a lot of entrepreneurs, and I would say systems-changing entrepreneurs. Look at Osama bin Laden. Systems changer for sure. If I look at the three qualities of what it takes to be an entrepreneur, which is, it's somebody who seizes an opportunity where others don't see it, is highly resourceful in the face of very constraining resources, and basically mobilizes a huge movement and drives through systems change. But there was something massively, not good about the whole change that he drove. So in response to your question, I don't see it as antithesis. I don't see socialism as the antithesis of entrepreneurial venturing either. I see individualism as important, but equally so the recognition that there needs to be a team and a wider ecosystem effort that includes government as change agents.
Anyone else? Yes. Lady just up in halfway up. Two ladies.
Thanks very much, Pamela. My name's Louisa Cass. I'm a consultant in international development. I'm just interested to follow on the comment about government. Governments in the UK and Australia are trialling new approaches to service delivery like social benefit bonds. I'm curious about, given your comment around government's role, how you see those sorts of trials and the potential of them.
I very positively. However, I think we're really in diapers in terms of, how this movement is progressing. The jury's not in on how this, if I look at the initial one in the UK around recidivism, there's still not evidence that this has actually worked. I think that government is very important in terms of laying down certain rules, etc., but the flexibility is often not there that's needed for these kinds of things to really take their time to grow. And I think that just as in international development, development takes a long time. And donors are very impatient and they want to see everything done in a New York minute. And so it's like, well, AIDS, you got a project on AIDS? Okay, in 2 years you're going to cure AIDS, right? Or something like this. And I think there is a real, I don't know how you say this, but misalignment between development time and donor time, just the way there is between governments. Governments are in power for a certain finite period of time, drive through that change, and then scratch everything the other government did because obviously they were from the wrong party or they had the wrong whatever, and let's start all over again. So this is the danger of the social, anything that government becomes involved with, is that the change in political parties is such that you can undo a whole generation of progress.
Just behind.
Hi Pamela, my name's Lucille and I'm from Impact Social Enterprise. You've made the great point that we need to get better at scaling socially catalytic entrepreneurial ventures and that hackathons and other startup-focused enterprise education programs are simply not sufficient for teaching this skill. The flip side of this is that the startup stage is a great tool for education because students can start with a blank slate and explore business principles that can scale social impact. So if not hackathons, could you give some examples of other great ways to hands-on teach young people about social innovation?
Yeah, first of all, I'm sorry if I gave the impression, which I realize I did, that I don't see merit in hackathons and et cetera, et cetera. But that seems to be the entire focus of what we're doing, okay? So that was in the spirit of my remark. What we've started at Oxford and we're trialing for the second year with great success is this approach called apprenticing with a problem. Apprenticing with a problem is, let's say you've got a student that says, I'm really committed to Africa. I've never been to Africa. I'm really committed to helping small landholders. And what we want is for them to begin to do the due diligence that's needed to really understand what is the problem, who is affected, who are the stakeholders that keep this entrenched, who are the organizations that are out there really trying to solve this problem, where are the difficulties, et cetera, and create an entire landscape of, let's say, the solution landscape or the problem and solution landscape. And then the reward is, rather than saying, we love your business plan, here's X amount of money to support your business, when they don't know what the problem is they're solving. We give them the money to go and work in an organization that is actually doing this on the ground to try, for a certain period of time to understand what exactly is this organization doing? How would my approach be different? What can I learn from them? So that they are not feeling that they have to run off and, they come from Westchester County in New York, which is one of the wealthiest counties in the United States, and they're going to go to Cambodia to solve the education problem. So that they feel that they're beginning to understand more and more and more about that problem. And own it or not. Own it or not. Is that a response? Good.
Do you have any questions from this side of the room? Yes, David.
My name is David Carbines. I work at Engineers Without Borders. When considering business models that should or could be looking at catalytic social change, lots of the social enterprise, forgive the term, models coming out of Australia are philanthro-consumerism, so buy and donate.
Are what?
Philanthro, a dollar in your purchase goes overseas.
Oh God, I hate that.
Or a buy one, donate one. I was just going to ask how you felt about them.
Okay. Okay. As you get older, you don't give a damn what you say. I'll tell you, you just say what you feel. Tom's shoes totally destroyed the shoe industry in the countries, in other words, the local industry. I think they learned a lot from that lesson. And Warby Parker, all of these organizations like that, I think they need to rethink, really apprentice with a problem on the ground of who's the industry that's going to be affected. One of the things, we just did this study, which I found, I was really excited about this, with some of my colleagues on the Oxford faculty. We wanted to know, we keep looking at all these incredible social innovations on the ground in the area of health that are coming out of grassroots emerging, whether it's local government, whether it's entrepreneurs, whether it's, whatever, NGOs, whatever. And we looked at where are these really innovative models, having an impact. And what we did was we found that many of them that were, number one, were not so great at collecting evidence. But number two, when they did have evidence, what kind of evidence does government need to prove that this works? What kind of evidence do other donors need to prove that this works? And there was kind of a mismatch between, what governments were looking for, or what, and in many cases, governments weren't looking for any evidence. They were just sort of supporting their cronies, or, a good story. And oftentimes you'll hear from, social entrepreneurs, well, it doesn't matter about my evidence because, in fact, all they want to hear are stories. They don't care about evidence. So one of the things that really, really struck me was how subjective this kind of process, really is in terms of convincing people that you have a scalable approach. And I think we need to be much, much better at at that in terms of how do we help organizations actually build the evidence that they need.
We have a common language for money, so the accounting standards and profit and all that stuff. Do we need a common language for impact?
We'll never have that. We will never have that. This drive, this sort of idea. I mean, how do you measure the taste of an ice cream cone? For you, or for you, or for you. It's all going to be different, There are some common markers, but we keep measuring outputs rather than outcomes. And even the idea of impact, that's a pipe dream, because there are many, many initiatives out there that are having great outcomes, but they can't attribute impact. Who knows what's going on else in that environment, and how much that's contributing to the change they're seeing. But they can measure outcomes. Not outputs, how many people, blah, 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 blah. No, outcomes. And that, for me, is the driver for that kind of monitoring.
We have time for one last question. Up the top there. Yes.
Hi, Doug from Hub and Spoke Co-working. Just had a question on how you see businesses linking together in a way to collectively leverage their resources for impact in a bigger way, rather than kind of the traditional where individual companies have their approaches to
Yeah, there's some really interesting developments. For example, I was very heartened by one particular initiative that grew out of an attack that Greenpeace did on Nike. And it was about using some sort of toxic chemical in their running shoes or whatever. And so they were going to go after them. And Nike said, you know what, if you go after us, you need to go after Adidas, you need to go after Puma, you need to go after, because we're all using that. And so what they did was they established what we call a pre-competitive collaborative initiative, which was where all of these companies that are competitors came together and agreed that they would stop using this and find an alternative. And so you're seeing some really interesting things coming out in a pre-competitive way to kind of drive through changes that are needed in terms of their own supply chains or practices. I'm not saying this is an epidemic of this kind of thing, but it's beginning to happen. And I think that the corporate sector more and more is coming to realize that unless there are these networking opportunities, and you're having thousands of, whether it's sustainable capitalism or inclusive capitalism or all of these names that are coming out of these initiatives that are basically corporate driven, or at least corporate, led, are some interesting developments in this sphere, although they're still incipient.